Baghdad, a demonstration of defiance as war draws near. And in New York, the UN Secretary General makes a last-minute appeal to prevent war. That story now on the Channel 10 News.
Live.
Larry. Real possibility that in just 59 minutes, well, it could be war. The UN-imposed deadline for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait comes at the stroke of midnight. Outside the United Nations today, cries for an end to U.S. involvement in the Gulf even before a single bullet is fired. And inside the UN, diplomats said no further Security Council action would come and that war seemed all but inevitable. Just as the Secretary General issued a final plea.
15 January advances and the world stands poised between peace and war. I most sincerely appeal to President Saddam Hussein to turn the course of events away from catastrophe and towards a new era of justice and harmony.
Javier Perez de Cuellar also made a promise that if Saddam agrees to withdraw from Kuwait, he will not be attacked by the multinational force. And at this hour, still no word exactly when or even if President Bush will use the authority granted him to send the United States to war. Mr. Bush met with key economic advisors today to discuss another important issue, the nation's money problems. And then later, he took a walk alone on the White House grounds, obviously to ponder his options as this ominous deadline looms even closer.
And tonight, on the brink of war, the Pentagon says more than 630,000 troops from 28 nations are lined up against Iraq. More than 400,000 of those troops are Americans. And again today in Saudi Arabia, the forces of Operation Desert Shield got underway with their weapons for war. While waiting for the order to fight, the soldiers say they feel constant changing emotions.
The emotions come up and down as a tide.
The U.S. military is also monitoring any indications that Saddam Hussein may strike first. And in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein today called on his people to demonstrate their strength in the face of a war. For the Iraqis, this has become a fight to defend their homeland.
We feel that we are strong with our people. And also we are in our country and on our land.
If you defend your country, you have to die. What can you do? Have we got any other option?
But as the sun went down in Baghdad tonight, people grew more anxious, taping up windows in their homes and waiting like the rest of the world.
And as the world waits, a lot of prayers for peace are still being offered.
Meg Grant joins us live now from a prayer vigil on the campus of St. Joseph University.
Arthur and Diane, that's right. We're live at St. Joseph's University. The faculty and students here have come almost to the end now of a 24-hour prayer vigil for peace. They're very much in the quiet and private meditation part of this vigil now. And this is, as you can imagine, one of just many all around the Delaware Valley, people of all races and ages and religions spending quiet time together to pray for peace.
Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?
They sang for their husbands and fathers, their brothers and sisters serving the Gulf. They sang and stood in silent vigil under the huge stone arch that remembers the soldiers who died at Valley Forge so that America could live. Janet Way used to take her son sledding here. Today,
my son is in the 3rd Marines, in the 3rd Infantry, right at the Kuwait border.
And almost everyone here has someone in the Gulf, and now they're here to protest, exercising one of the basic rights guaranteed by George Washington's troops one freezing winter 200 years ago. And protest again, this time by men and women who are veterans of combat.
We've lived through it once. We're committed, and we don't want anybody to live through it again. We don't want anybody over there.
I was arrested for protesting against the war. I was just recently back from Vietnam, from spending a tour with the 1st Marine Division along the demilitarized zone. I hate to have to do this again.
But they are doing it again. Ron Farizzi with his son, for his son.
No blood for oil! No blood for oil!
For his son, who is 19, just the age that Ron was when he went to Vietnam. And that, he says, is why he's here. And here at St. Joseph's University, you can hear perhaps quietly behind me the voices raised in quiet song. In a few minutes, all of the students and teachers will proceed in a candlelight march to the bell tower here, and the bells at St. Joseph's will toll at midnight. And midnight, of course, Diane and Arthur, the hour that all of us greet with great apprehension.
And it approaches. Thank you very much, Meg.
All right, and in Center City tonight, there was a packed house there as a local church sponsored a town meeting for anyone who would attend. The subject, going to war.
A grouping of people need the poor to fight their war, and that is who is there.
The rally was called Speak Out for Peace in the Middle East, and it was highly spirited, standing room only. They sat in the aisles, stood in the doorways, and waved American flags with peace signs outside. They wanted their voices heard.
We are selling arms to the enemies of Israel that are our friends for this second, but in the next second, who knows who friends they will be.
They cried out for peace, for patience, and for prayer, and they called on all Americans everywhere to keep the faith for keeping America out of war.
I think it's really pointless. There's a lot of people over there. You know, to me, it's just going to be like a lot of lives wasted, you know? For what? For oil? It's not worth it.
I think that the money could be much better spent than spending it on a war that doesn't even need to happen.
Is it too late for us to stay out of a war?
No, it's never too late to get out of war. There's always another way. It's just people not looking anymore.
Just some of the voices that were heard there tonight, Diane, they seem to all have a sense of desperation that now is their last chance to try and make a difference, but they all have their fingers crossed tonight.
So do we all. Voices heard all over the country. Let's go to Washington, where many voices were raised today. Channel 10's Larry Kane has been watching events unfold as the deadline nears. Larry?
Diane and Arthur, a significant development outside of Washington tonight. The Iraqi ambassador to the U.S. left our country with some somber words for the future. Mohammed al-Mashat and much of the Iraq embassy staff left Dulles Airport in suburban Virginia tonight. The ambassador said an American attack would mean war against the entire Arab world.
You have to be sure that you are going to gain the hatred and animosities of all Arabs for decades to come, as well as 1 billion Muslims throughout the world.
Meantime, outside the White House tonight, a candlelight vigil where earlier 36 demonstrators were arrested. And there were more protests in the Capitol from people on both sides of the war controversy. The voices of America heard loud and clear in Washington today. First, a pro-administration rally by college students across from the Iraqi embassy.
We decided that we had seen enough of the leftists out there demonstrating against the president and against our troops being in the Middle East, and we decided it was time that we needed to get out there and support the president and support our troops.
The rally was enthusiastic but small in contrast to an anti-war effort just 6 blocks away. One of the most vocal anti-war protests of the day took place at this church, a rally and prayer service by African-American students.
And yet no one is talking about a war beginning when 70% of the frontline troops will be minorities.
The Reverend George Stallings sounded the anti-war cry at a rally of African-American students against the war. It was an overflow crowd, and some students were angry about the date of the deadline for Iraq to come out of Kuwait.
And I'm especially opposed to the idea of using Martin Luther King's birthday to send a symbolic message that war is okay.
The featured speaker at the Metropolitan AME Church was the old anti-war warrior himself, Dick Gregory, who tells me he believes the momentum is growing.
This is the first time I've ever fasted where people are calling from all over the country, students, church folk, saying, I want to join you.
The momentum is also growing for the possibility of war at this very dangerous 11th hour in our history. And the question is, what happens next? Live in our studios tonight, our noted Middle East expert, Dr. Fred Fry of the University of Pennsylvania. What happens next? Will George Bush act in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Maybe 48 hours, I hope. It will be morning in the Middle East at midnight here tonight, and so they would not initiate anything until darkness. I hope and think that he's likely to wait maybe a day or two, but he will act fairly quickly, I believe.
Will Saddam Hussein blink in the next 24 to 48 hours? Will he change his mind? Can we expect something dramatic from him?
We certainly hope so. I don't think so, but the one possibility is that he will negotiate not with us, to give us that credit, but with the French or the Arabs, and he will do so after the deadline to show his defiance.
There are some people who think that he's willing to take a war to stand up to the Arab world and say he stood up to the United States. What do you think about that?
Yes, I agree with that. I think that's his basic policy. I think he believes it can be a war of attrition and that he'll outlast us.
Speaking of outlasting, do you think the U.S. military is ready in the air to take this war without committing ground forces at all? Is that a likely scenario that we could do it just with our Air Force?
You've asked a key question, Larry. I don't know, but one of the things we'll try is to break his back by air power. I am dubious about that, but that's the first phase of the entire operation.
Dr. Fred Fry, thanks for joining us tonight. Dr. Fred Fry, Middle East expert from the University of Pennsylvania. And later in the broadcast, Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey will be joining me live from Washington. Diane, Arthur?
All right, thank you, Larry. And still ahead tonight, we'll take you to Governor Bob Casey's inaugural in Hershey, where the prospects of war hang over the proceedings.
And it's a celebration tonight on the birthday of the late Martin Luther King Jr. and the ideals for which he stood. The Channel 10 News Update will continue.
As Robert Casey sworn into a second term as Pennsylvania governor. Casey took the oath of office from State Supreme Court Chief Justice Robert N. C. Nix at noon today. But the usually festive atmosphere of inauguration has been tempered by the prospects of war.
And that subdued mood continues tonight at the inaugural ball in Hershey. Jane Robelot is there live. Jane?
As you can tell here, the mood is very festive right now by the music. The governor and Mrs. Casey made a grand entrance to lasers right behind us on these grand ballroom steps. But as the governor came down and addressed the people, he asked them to have a good time, celebrate, but also to make a silent prayer for peace.
The governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and Mrs. Casey.
This event, of course, is a celebration of democracy, a celebration of freedom, and it's a night for happiness and looking to the future. But at the same time, all of us know and are very conscious of the fact that it's a night of tension and concern and danger.
But before the governor and Mrs. Casey's grand entrance, the pride of the Delaware Valley was well represented.
I've got about 40 cadets here from Valley Forge Military Academy and Junior College, and they're here to help the governor celebrate his inauguration.
But other Philadelphians attending the ball held a more somber mood. The threat of war veils the celebration.
Somewhat somber because of 12 o'clock tonight and what people are perhaps anticipating.
Nevertheless, the more than 2,000 partygoers are enjoying themselves tonight. And in the Camelot Room, they're moving to the soft sounds of jazz.
How can you not have a good time? But I'm feeling guilty for having a good time because I'm also very worried about my 20-year-old son, who's a junior at Temple University, who might be draft bait right now.
And apparently a lot of people shared that sentiment, fear of war tonight, because some of the servers here tell me that the crowd is much smaller than they expected. Nevertheless,
terrorist targets in the United States. Warnings are already spreading across the nation. And new waves of dissent as the war deadline arrives. From CBS News, this is America Tonight, with Dan Rather and Charles Kuralt in New York and Leslie Stahl in Washington.
Good evening. The minutes are ticking away. Midnight is the time appointed by the world for Iraq to leave Kuwait. And as far as we can tell, not one of the 545,000 Iraqi soldiers in that little country has budged. So now they face 680,000 U.S. and allied troops authorized by the UN to attack anytime after the next few minutes have passed. We will be here with you to see the deadline come and go. The diplomats are talked out, exhausted and despairing after doing their best. Western ambassadors have left Baghdad for their safety, and tonight Iraq's ambassador to the United States, Mohammed al-Mashat, left Washington.
We do not want war. We have said it time again. We will not be the first one to attack at all. We are only defending ourselves. But if we are attacked, then God knows where the flame will reach.
God knows where the flame will reach. Whether or not Iraq's insistence that it won't strike first can be believed, the sand is running out of the hourglass now to the midnight deadline. High alert in the sand on both sides of the line across Saudi Arabia and its desert. Important to note that President Bush has not said he's decided to strike. If and when the president does give the order to use force, it would go through the chain of command at the U.S. Defense Department, where David Martin is watching and waiting and has the latest for us now. David?
The only aircraft confirmed in the early going on the attacks against Iraq and Iraqi forces in Kuwait were U.S. Air Force planes. It has now been confirmed, as we reported earlier, that British Tornado fighter jets are also involved, and elements of the Saudi Arabian Air Force are also involved. For analysis and comment on President Bush's speech, we go to CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Well, Dan, I think the principal thing about the speech is that here is the president making the announcement that we all dreaded would have to be made and that he probably dreaded having to make, but felt necessary. I think the question now is, of course, how unified the country may be. You and Charles Kuralt were talking about that just a little while ago. Certainly the polls don't indicate that he's going into this war with anything like the unanimity of public opinion that we had always understood the United States government, and particularly its military, would demand after the Vietnam experience before it committed to another action. He doesn't have that at all. I think there's one thing to remember. Probably the reaction of those who are opposed to this war is going to grow even stronger as the days go on and the casualties mount, unless by some miracle it is a terribly quick war. But as that happens, I think we all ought to keep in mind and hope that we do not have an increased division of Americans with the ugly charges that one side or the other is unpatriotic. Those who will resist this war, even as those who support the war, are patriotic in their own lights. Those who resist the war, well, perhaps there's a very small fringe group that wishes America itself ill, but I don't think that's very many. Most of those people marching out there and screaming out there and hollering out there are those who really sincerely believe that America's best course is not to be in that war. And even as that mother we saw in Charleston, South Carolina, wept over her despair that her two close kin are there in the war and that she doesn't want this war, there are many, many others, hundreds and thousands of others who will be opposed to this war, who are just as convinced that their side is the patriotic side. And we can't assume that one side or the other has a lock on patriotism.
Charles Kuralt has been watching the reaction as the war unfolds, watching it north and south. Charles?
We were talking about those towns where soldiers come from, Dan. And one of those is Fayetteville, North Carolina, home of the 82nd Airborne, Fort Bragg. Those troopers are over there, and sooner or later, no doubt, they're going to have to go into action to expel Iraq from Kuwait.